At 10:47 in the morning on November 1st, 1943, 5 Marine Corsairs from VMF 215 intercepted a Japanese strike formation over Bougainville Island. The Americans were outnumbered badly. The attacking force consisted of a large formation of Cape bombers escorted by Zeros, bound for the crowded beaches and transports at Torquemada, where Allied forces had just landed. What happened next was entirely predictable to anyone who had followed the air war in the South Pacific for the previous 9 months. The Corsairs dove from altitude, made their passes at speed, scattered the formation, and pulled away before the Zeros could regroup. Lieutenant Robert Hansen shot down 2 Japanese aircraft before Kate's rear gunner put his plane into the sea. Hansen paddled for 6 hours in a rubber raft before a destroyer picked him up. He came back humming a Cole Porter song. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching from today. The story of the Corsair over Rabaul is usually told as a story of American supremacy, a superior machine arriving in the theater and sweeping the skies clean. That is partly true and mostly wrong. The full story is stranger and more instructive than that. It is a story about an airplane that the United States Navy declared unsuitable for the job it was designed to do, and which therefore went and did something else entirely. It is a story about a set of engineering problems that were never fully solved, and how those same problems, in a different theater, against a different enemy, at a different altitude, turned out not to matter. And it is a story about what happens when the side that believes itself to hold the doctrinal advantage encounters men who have worked out exactly how to fight around every weakness the doctrine assumed was fatal. To understand it properly, you have to go back to a drawing board in Stratford, Connecticut in 1938. Rex Beisel was the chief engineer at Chance Vought Aircraft when the United States Navy issued a specification for a new carrier fighter. The Bureau of Aeronautics had thought hard about what they wanted. They wanted speed above everything. They wanted a fighter that could climb, that could intercept, that could run down anything the Japanese or the Germans were likely to put in the air. To get that kind of performance, the Navy was willing to accept a larger aircraft than they had previously flown off carriers. What they were not willing to accept was a propeller that sat too low to give clearance on the deck. Beisel's team built the answer to the specification around the most powerful radial engine then available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. It had 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, so many that a single ring around the crankcase was not sufficient to hold them all. In its war emergency rating, the Double Wasp could produce over 2,000 horsepower, and the only way to convert that power into forward thrust efficiently was with a propeller large enough to match it. The Hamilton Standard Hydromatic that Vought selected for the F4U spanned 13 feet 4 inches from tip to tip. That is 4 meters across. On a fighter, the largest propeller ever fitted to a single-seat aircraft up to that point in history. The problem was elementary physics. A 13-foot propeller on a fighter that was meant to operate off a carrier deck required either very long landing gear to lift the engine high enough that the blades cleared the planking, or some other solution. Long landing gear on a carrier aircraft was a problem in its own right. Long gear meant more weight, more drag, more stress at touchdown, and a higher center of gravity that made the aircraft want to topple. Beisel's team found the other solution. They bent the wings. The inverted gull wing that makes the Corsair instantly recognizable was not an aesthetic choice. It was a geometric calculation. By angling the wings downward from the fuselage root and then back upward to the outer section, the designers placed the main landing gear attachment point at the lowest part of the wing's arc. The gear legs could be short, strong, and compliant with carrier deck requirements, because the bent wing geometry itself was providing the propeller clearance. The right angle junction between the wing and the fuselage cleaned up the aerodynamic interference that a conventional low wing produced, and the oil coolers for the engine could be housed in the wing roots, close to the power plant, where they belonged. The XF4U prototype first flew on the 29th of May, 1940. Within a few months, it became the first American fighter to exceed 400 miles per hour in level flight during testing. The Navy, watching all of this with considerable satisfaction, moved toward production. By July of 1942, the first production F4U 1S were coming off the line at Stratford. Carrier trials began aboard the escort carrier USS Sangamon in September of that year. The trials went badly. There were multiple problems, and they were not minor. The long nose of the aircraft, required by the massive engine and its associated cowling, placed the cockpit so far aft that the pilot had almost no forward visibility during the low-speed approach to the deck. A carrier landing in that era required a pilot to see the landing signal officer standing at the deck's edge, watching the approach and giving cut engine signals with his paddles. With the Corsair's nose blocking the view, a pilot coming down the approach path could not see the officer until he was almost over the ramp. The aircraft, contemporaries recalled, had a nose like a fire hose. You pointed it at something and hoped. The second problem was the landing gear. The shock absorbers in the main struts were too stiff. When the wheels hit the carrier deck, the aircraft did not settle. It bounced. A bouncing carrier aircraft is not an inconvenient aircraft. It is a dangerous one. The tail hook, skipping across the deck at speed, missed the arresting wires. The aircraft went through the crash barrier, or over the side, or into the aircraft parked forward. Pilots of the era nicknamed the Corsair the Ensign Eliminator. The third problem was aerodynamic. The left wing stalled at a slightly different speed than the right wing. In the final moments of a carrier approach, when the pilot cut the throttle on the signal from the deck officer and the aircraft dropped toward the wires, this asymmetric stall could produce a violent snap roll. A snap roll at 50 feet above a carrier deck, with the throttle cut and no airspeed remaining, was not survivable. The Navy made its decision in early 1943. The F4U was not cleared for carrier operations. It would be assigned to the Marine Corps, which flew from land bases and therefore did not need to land on a moving deck in a pitching sea. The Marines would take the bent wing bird that the Navy did not want, and they would fly from the mud and gravel of the South Pacific Islands, and whatever they could make of it was theirs to discover. What the Navy considered a defect was, in the theater the Corsair was about to enter, nearly irrelevant. 12 F4U, 1S from VMF, 124, under Major William Guise, arrived at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal on the 12th of February, 1943. The pilots had an average of 25 hours in the aircraft. They had only recently received the machines and had almost no time to develop tactics for them. The following day, they were sent to Bougainville as escorts for Army B-17s and Navy PB-4Y Liberator bombers. It was, as one account noted, a lot to ask. They did it, taking some losses. The second mission, 2 days later, was the event that defined the Corsair's first weeks in theater. On February 14th, VMF 124 escorted another formation of liberators to Kahili Airdrome on Bougainville. The Japanese, warned by their own coast watchers along the island chain, were ready. What followed cost the Americans 8 aircraft for 3 Japanese planes shot down. The Marines immediately called it the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The Corsair had entered combat with a loss ratio that looked, from the outside, like evidence of inferiority. It was not. It was evidence of something more instructive, that a superior machine in the hands of pilots who do not yet know how to use it is not necessarily a superior weapon. The Corsair's first engagement revealed everything that was wrong with the approach the Marines were taking and nothing about what the aircraft was actually capable of. The man who would do the most to establish what it was capable of had arrived at Guadalcanal with VMF 124. His name was Kenneth Walsh, and he had enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1933, not as a pilot, but as a private. He had worked his way through enlisted aviation training and received his wings in 1937, one of a small cohort of Marine enlisted aviators who formed the institutional backbone of the Corps' fighter arm at a time, when officer pilots were a much smaller fraction of the total. By 1943, he was a first lieutenant, and he was about to become the first Corsair ace. Walsh's insight into the aircraft was tactical rather than technical. He noticed what the Corsair could not do. It could not turn with a zero at low speed. The Mitsubishi A6M had been designed from inception around the principle of minimum weight, maximum maneuverability. It sacrificed armor protection, self-sealing fuel tanks, and structural redundancy in exchange for a power-to-weight ratio and a turning radius that no Allied fighter could match in a low-altitude, slow-speed engagement. In a turning fight below 300 miles per hour, the Zero had a lethal advantage. What Walsh also noticed was what the Corsair could do that the Zero could not. The Double Wasp gave the F4U a climb rate and a top speed that outperformed the Zero significantly at altitude. More critically, the Corsair could dive. In a high-speed dive, the Zero's controls locked up. Its ailerons, built light to save weight, became almost immovable as airspeed increased. The control stiffness was a known phenomenon, documented after American intelligence had recovered a largely intact Zero from a bog in the Aleutian Islands in the summer of 1942, shipped it to North Island Naval Air Station in California, and had American test pilots fly it against their own aircraft. The report from that analysis circulated through the fighter community. A Zero in a high-speed dive was not pursuing you. It was falling. The tactic that emerged from this was not complicated. Walsh and the pilots of VMF 124 stopped trying to match the Zero on its own terms and started imposing different terms. Find altitude. Stay at altitude. When the engagement develops, convert that altitude to speed in a diving pass, fire a burst, and recover its speed before the Zero can respond. Do not slow down. Do not try to turn. Do not accept an invitation to circle at low speed and wait for the Zero's pilot to bring you into his killing envelope. The Corsair was not a dancer. It was a sprinter. You used it like a sprinter. On the 13th of May, 1943, Walsh became the first Corsair ace, shooting down his fourth, fifth, and sixth Zeros in a single mission over the Russells. By the end of August, his score stood at 20. On the 30th of August, he attacked a formation of 50 Zeros that were intercepting American B-24 bombers over Bougainville alone, after his wingmen were separated from him in the initial engagement. He shot down 4 of them before his own aircraft was so badly damaged that he ditched in the sea. Several Corsairs eventually arrived to scatter the remaining Zeros. The Seabees on Vela La Vela borrowed a boat and rowed out to pull him from the water. For his actions that afternoon, Walsh was eventually awarded the Medal of Honor. By the standard of the previous February, when the Corsair had lost 8 aircraft to the Zero's 3, the ratio had inverted entirely. The reason it inverted was not primarily a change in the aircraft. The aircraft was the same. What changed was the doctrine, the systematic unit-by-unit understanding of where the Corsair was strong and where it was lethal to engage. VMF 124 had bled learning it. The squadrons that came after them inherited the lesson. By the autumn of 1943, the air campaign in the South Pacific had acquired a specific objective that concentrated every lesson the Marine Corsair squadrons had learned. Rabaul. The Japanese had turned Rabaul, on the northeastern tip of New Britain, into the most heavily defended base in the South Pacific. The harbor at Simpson Harbor could accommodate a fleet. The airfields at Vinakanau, Lakanai, Rapopo, Tobera, and Karavat together formed a layered air defense that could, in the late months of 1943, put several hundred aircraft into the air. The garrison that supported them and the anti-aircraft positions that ringed the approaches made Rabaul, in the estimation of the American commanders who planned the air campaign against it, the hardest target in the theater. Operation Cartwheel, the Allied strategy for reducing Rabaul, had originally contemplated a ground assault. By August of 1943, that plan had been abandoned. The American High Command, watching the cost of island-by-island assault against Japanese defenders fighting from prepared positions, had decided to bypass the fortress instead. They would not take Rabaul. They would strangle it. They would destroy its air power, cut its supply lines, crater its runways, and leave nearly 100,000 Japanese defenders isolated and irrelevant on an island that would never again threaten the Allied advance. The instrument of that strangulation was air power, and the sharp edge of that air power in the Solomon sector was the Marine Corsair squadrons. The first major carrier raid on Rabaul came on November 2, 1943, when 5th Air Force land-based bombers struck Simpson Harbor and found a large concentration of Japanese cruisers and destroyers that had assembled there. The strike damaged or sank a significant fraction of the fleet. In response, Admiral Manichi Koga ordered the carrier air groups of the 1st Air Squadron to reinforce Rabaul. These were not garrison pilots. These were the carrier-trained veterans of operations that had sunk or damaged American ships across the Central and Southern Pacific. Koga was essentially deploying his strategic reserve to hold his most important base. Within 11 days, that reserve had lost 43 of 82 Zeros, 38 of 45 dive bombers, and 34 of 40 torpedo planes. The battle, for purposes of the Japanese carrier aviation program, was a catastrophe from which it would never fully recover. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Corsair squadrons that were pressing the attack during those November weeks and into December operated under conditions that the carrier rejection in 1942 had accidentally made to their advantage. Because the Navy had declared the Corsair unsuitable for carrier operations, the Marine Corps had flown it exclusively from land bases. Land bases were not mobile. They were fixed, known, routinely attacked, perpetually muddy, and chronically short of support equipment. But they were also critically stable. A Marine pilot landing a Corsair on a dirt strip at Guadalcanal or Munda or Torquina did not need to thread a bouncing aircraft onto a moving deck in open ocean. The asymmetric stall, the oil leak onto the canopy, the stiff landing gear that made the aircraft dangerous on a carrier. None of these mattered on a land airstrip of adequate length. The flaw that had made the aircraft dangerous to Navy pilots had been, in effect, promoted out of the problem by the geography of the theater. Meanwhile, the thing that had almost disqualified the Corsair from service entirely, its enormous propeller and the asymmetric wing that resulted from it, was in combat doing exactly what Rex Beisel's engineering team had designed it to do. The Double Wasp's 2,000 horsepower, turning that 13-foot 4-inch propeller, gave the aircraft a rate of climb and a top speed that allowed Marine pilots to enter and exit engagements over Rabaul almost entirely on their own terms. The squadrons had learned Walsh's lesson. Altitude was the Corsair's primary weapon before any trigger was pulled. Arrive high, dive on speed, make your pass, climb away. The Zero could not follow the dive. The Zero could not match the climb. The Zero had only one opportunity to impose its own terms, which was to trap the Corsair at low altitude and slow speed, and the Marine pilots were experienced enough by the autumn of 1943 to refuse that trap almost every time. The men flying those missions were, by any reasonable measure, an unusual cohort. VMF 214, led by Major Gregory Boyington, had been assembled in the theater from replacement pilots who had been assigned to other squadrons and simply gathered together when an unexpected operational need arose. The story that has attached itself to that squadron over the years, that its pilots were a collection of misfits retrieved from the brig, is a good story and mostly fiction. What the Black Sheep actually were was a group of pilots who had been in the South Pacific long enough to have opinions about how to fight the war and who had found, in Boyington, a commander who agreed with their opinions and was willing to act on them without waiting for approval from above. Boyington had served with the American Volunteer Group in China before returning to the Marine Corps and was not, by any measure, a man who operated comfortably within institutional constraints. He was also a superb pilot and a tactician of real sophistication. Throughout the autumn of 1943, VMF 214 staged missions from Torquina Airfield on Bougainville, a strip that had been carved out of the jungle barely weeks before the squadron arrived. The tactical situation when Boyington's men were flying was often fluid in ways that a more cautious commander might have used as justification for caution. Boyington used it as justification for aggression. In December of 1943, as the Allied air campaign against Rabaul intensified, a different kind of Corsair pilot arrived in theater. His name was Robert Hansen, born in Lucknow, India, in 1920, the son of Methodist missionaries from Massachusetts. He had been a wrestler, a bicycle tourist across Europe, and a flyer since 1942. He had first flown combat with VMF 214 and then transferred to VMF 215, the Fighting Corsairs. By November of 1943, he had 5 victories. What happened to Hansen over the following weeks was nearly incomprehensible in statistical terms. Between the 18th of January and the 30th of January, 1944, he made 5 escort missions to Rabaul and shot down 20 Japanese aircraft. 5, then 1, then 3, then 4 alone after being separated from his division over Simpson Harbor, then 4 more on the 30th when VMF 215 escorted Grumman TBF Avengers in a strike. His total stood at 25. In 17 days of combat over the most heavily defended target in the South Pacific, in an aircraft that had nearly been declared unfit for operational use, Hansen had accumulated a kill score that would have been considered implausible if the individual missions had not been witnessed and confirmed. The tactic was the same one the Corsair squadrons had been developing since February. Altitude, speed, diving pass, recovery, repeat. Hansen was not inventing anything. He was executing the doctrine with a particular precision and a particular willingness to keep pressing when other pilots would have broken off, and the aircraft's structural integrity, its willingness to accept the loads of repeated high-speed dives and recoveries, made that precision possible. The Corsair was not a delicate machine. The Zero was. On the 3rd of February, 1944, a mission to Rabaul was canceled after takeoff due to overcast. The formation turned back. On the return leg, Hansen pulled away from the group and made a strafing pass at a coastal gun emplacement near Cape St. George on the southern tip of New Ireland. That gun position had been firing at American aircraft for weeks. Hansen brought his Corsair down low, put the emplacement in his sight, fired, and did not pull out in time. A wingman saw the aircraft strike the water. There was only wreckage. Hansen was 23 years old. He would have been 24 the following day. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The air campaign over Rabaul effectively ended 3 weeks later. The final air battle took place on the 19th of February, 1944. Allied aircraft found little shipping in the harbor and expended their ordnance against the airfields instead. Japanese opposition was minimal. 2 days earlier, Spruance's carriers had struck Truk, the great Japanese anchorage in the Carolines, and the decision had been made to evacuate most of the remaining Japanese aircraft from Rabaul before they were destroyed on the ground. The base still held nearly 100,000 Japanese soldiers. It held their food supplies, their weapons, their anti-aircraft guns, their fortifications. What it no longer held was the ability to contest the air. The garrison's effective military existence ended that February, though the formal surrender would not come until September of 1945. From November of 1943 to March of 1944, the air campaign over Rabaul destroyed approximately 359 Japanese aircraft. Airsols, the Allied air forces in the Solomon sector, lost 136 aircraft in the same period. The overall kill ratio across the Corsair's Pacific War would eventually settle at 11-1, though that figure incorporates the full arc of the aircraft's career from the early confusion of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre through Okinawa in 1945 and should not be read as applying uniformly to any single phase of the campaign. What it does reflect is the cumulative product of an institutional learning process that began with VMF 124 absorbing the lessons of its first disastrous engagements and ended with pilots who could execute high-speed boom-and-zoom attacks against a garrisoned fortress harbor with something approaching predictable outcomes. The institutional thread connecting those endpoints is worth following because it contains the answer to the question the Corsair story actually poses. The aircraft that arrived at Henderson Field in February of 1943 was the same aircraft, in all essential respects, that broke the air campaign over Rabaul 11 months later. The propeller was the same diameter. The wing had the same bend. The landing gear still bounced if you landed it hard enough on the right surface. The oil coolers still whistled in a dive. The double wasp still made the aircraft difficult to fly at slow speed in the wrong hands. None of the Navy's 1942 objections had been invalidated. They had simply become irrelevant, because the theater in which the aircraft was operating was not the theater the objections had been written for. This matters in a way that goes beyond the technical history of one fighter design. The Navy's evaluation of the Corsair was entirely correct on its own terms. The aircraft was dangerous on a carrier deck. The asymmetric stall was real. The bounce was real. The poor forward visibility was real. British Fleet Air Arm pilots, who received Corsairs under Lend-Lease and who were determined to operate them from carriers, eventually solved the visibility problem by developing a curved final approach that kept the deck in sight around the long nose until the last moment before touchdown. They also worked with the manufacturer on the landing gear strut damping. By 1944, the modifications were sufficient that the Navy cleared the Corsair for carrier operations. But that clearance came 2 years after the aircraft had already spent those 2 years doing something the Navy's evaluation had never assessed: flying land-based operations at altitude over a contested air corridor in the South Pacific in exactly the conditions that made every one of the carrier-specific deficiencies irrelevant. The men who made that happen did not do so because they understood the engineering analysis. Walsh and Hansen and Boynton and the hundreds of Marine pilots who flew those missions were not concerned with the Navy's 1942 carrier trial reports. They were concerned with staying alive in the air over Bougainville and Rabaul. And the way to stay alive, as VMF 124 had established at a cost and blood during the spring of 1943, was to use the aircraft where it was strong and refuse battle where it was weak. What they were doing, without naming it as such, was reverse engineering the Zero's vulnerability from the Corsair's own characteristics. The Zero's lightness, which made it lethal in a turning fight, was the same characteristic that made it unable to follow a Corsair in a dive. The Zero's agility at low speed was the same characteristic that made it dangerous to engage at low speed. The Corsair's weight and structural strength, which had contributed to the bounce problem on carrier decks and the stiffness that made it tricky in slow-speed handling, were the same characteristics that allowed it to survive high-speed dives intact and pull out without losing its wings. The defects and the capabilities were, in a sense, the same features viewed from different angles. The question was which angle the theater of operations placed you at. Rabaul placed the Corsair at exactly the right angle. The Japanese airmen who defended Rabaul during those months were, at least in the early phase of the campaign, not the exhausted garrison troops that would defend other bases later in the Pacific War. The carrier air groups that Koga had dispatched to reinforce the base in November of 1943 were, as noted, the cream of the Imperial Japanese Navy's aviator pool. Their loss in those 2 weeks was an irreplaceable catastrophe. The pilots who replaced them, drawn from training programs that the Navy had been accelerating under the pressure of attrition since Midway, were younger, less experienced, and increasingly flying aircraft, the Zero, that had not been substantially upgraded in 3 years of combat. The Corsair, meanwhile, was being flown by pilots whose institutional memory of how to fight the aircraft was accumulating in unit diaries and tactical debriefs and the oral transmission between experienced aviators and new arrivals that constitutes the real combat education system of any wartime Air Force. By the time Robert Hansen was flying those January missions to Simpson Harbor in 1944, the asymmetry between the two sides was not primarily a question of aircraft capability. It was a question of what each side knew about its own aircraft and about the other side's. The Japanese pilots defending Rabaul knew the Corsair was fast and that it dived and recovered rather than turning. They knew it was heavily armed, that its 650 caliber Browning machine guns could destroy a Zero with a brief burst of fire in a way that the lighter armament of some earlier American fighters could not. What they did not have was the time, the numbers, or the replacement stock to counter those characteristics effectively. The operational tempo the Allied air campaign was running raid after raid, day after day, was consuming Japanese pilots faster than the Japanese training pipeline could produce replacements. The Navy's rejection of the Corsair for carrier duty in 1942 had produced, through a sequence of consequences that no one planned, an aircraft doctrine that was exactly suited to this attrition campaign. Because the Marines had to fly from fixed land bases rather than carriers, they could not exploit the mobility of carrier aviation. What they could do was establish forward strips progressively closer to Rabaul as the island-hopping campaign advanced, reducing the transit time from airfield to target and increasing the time available for actual combat over the objective. Torquemada on Bougainville, where VMF 214 staged its December and January missions, was approximately 250 miles from Rabaul. That was within the Corsair's combat radius with a ferry tank, which meant that the aircraft could arrive over the target with useful fighting fuel remaining. The geometry of the campaign had been created by the Corsair's assignment to the Marines, which had been created by the carrier rejection, which had been created by a stiff landing gear strut and an asymmetric wing stall that had nothing to do with air combat. The accident of that engineering history had placed the right aircraft in the right theater at the right moment. This is the part of the story that does not fit neatly into the narrative of technological superiority. The Corsair was in some respects technically superior to the Zero. It was faster. It was more heavily armed. It could survive damage that would destroy a Zero. But those advantages had been present since the first day VMF 124 arrived at Guadalcanal. They had not prevented the Valentine's Day debacle. They had not, in the early months of 1943, produced kill ratios that justified the aircraft's reputation. The aircraft's superiority only became visible when the pilots flying it had developed the doctrine that allowed its strengths to be expressed and its weaknesses to be neutralized. The Zero, for its part, was not a bad aircraft in 1943. The analysis conducted by the Osprey historian Michael Claringbould, who worked from both American records and Japanese unit diaries to reconstruct actual losses in the specific Corsair versus Zero engagements of the Rabaul and Solomon's campaigns, found that the kill ratio in that specific period was considerably lower than the 11-to-1 figure often cited. The Zero Sun remained effective against the Corsair until February of 1944, when the Japanese withdrew their surviving airmen from Rabaul and ended the campaign. The American advantage in that theater was real. It was not the crushing numerical superiority that later Pacific campaigns would produce. It was a more contingent advantage, earned over months of learning and loss, that expressed itself most completely in the hands of pilots who had made themselves experts in an aircraft the Navy had not wanted. Pappy Boyington was shot down on the 3rd of January, 1944, over Rabaul, leading a combined formation of 40 to 50 Navy and Marine fighters. He was captured by a Japanese submarine and spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner. He survived, received the Medal of Honor, and became one of the most recognizable figures to emerge from the South Pacific Air War. Robert Hansen, shot down a month later strafing a coastal gun on a canceled mission's return leg, does not have that kind of afterlife. His name is on the destroyer USS Hansen, commissioned after the war. His Medal of Honor was presented to his mother at a ceremony on Boston Common. His remains were never recovered. The base they had helped to kill died slowly. 100,000 Japanese soldiers remained on Rabaul, supplied by submarine when supply was possible at all, slowly consuming their stockpiles, maintaining their fortifications, defending a position that would never be attacked. The final surrender came on the 6th of September, 1945, 3 weeks after the formal capitulation on Missouri. When Allied forces arrived to accept the surrender, they found not the 32,000 men intelligence had estimated, but 53,000. The garrison had endured in complete isolation for the better part of a year and a half. The airfields the Japanese had built there, Vinacana and Lakanai, in Rapopo and Tobara, went quiet in February of 1944. The runways crept over. The revetments filled with weeds. The last Zero had flown from Rabaul's 5 airfields less than 2 years after the first Marine Corsair had arrived at Guadalcanal with pilots who had 25 hours in type, no doctrine, and a general belief that an aircraft fast enough and powerful enough would find its own way to be useful. It had found its way. It found it in the air over Bougainville, in the lessons Walsh pulled from the wreckage of February, in the tactical debriefs that circulated through MAG-11's pilot pool, in the institutional memory that accumulated in the Marine fighter squadrons like a language that each new arrival had to learn from the men already there. The aircraft had been rejected for the role it was designed for and assigned to a role that did not exist until the war created it. The engineering defect that had nearly disqualified it from service was a defect on a carrier deck in the Atlantic approaches and not a defect over Simpson Harbor, where no carrier would ever operate, where altitude was everything, and where the sound of air rushing through an inverted gull wing's oil cooler intakes in a diving pass was, to the men on the receiving end, the last sound they heard. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.